Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blue Mondays, the GLORIO Blog's Eureka 7 podcast. Eureka 7 recap podcast, and welcome to the first of our bonus episodes. Now that we have finished the television show, we are going to take a brief dip in some parts of the Eureka 7 extended universe. Along for the ride with me, as always, there is Aqua. Hello, Aqua.
I'm glad to inform you that the technical difficulties we have been facing over the course of the last month have all been the fault of an invading species called the Corallian.
Yeah, that's
which
a
we
likely
must now
story.
exterminate at any cost to ascertain our humanity's survival.
Kill the aliens. I'm also, of course, joined by G. Hello, G.
Nothing has ever gone wrong in the extended universe. Extended universe material always works out. Definitely no problems whatsoever over here. Did you know in the EU material they say that Renton's midi-Corallian count was off the charts?
Now, look, let's not make comparisons we can't take back now, okay?
Would you say that Eureka 7's EU material is better than Star Wars?
I would probably say I would take the Eureka 7 expanded universe material over Attack of the Clones. Let's say,
Sure.
let's divide the pain equally there. No, this week, to kick off our look at some of the material surrounding the show, we are going to be looking at the show's manga adaptation, also called Psalm of Planets Eureka 7, as you would expect. This was published alongside the show. It started roughly when the show started. There's like a month difference, and finished roughly when the show ended there. It is by Jinsei Kataoka and Kazuma Kondou, who are a noted pair of writers/artists. Officially, Kataoka is listed as the writer and Kondou is listed as the artist, but my understanding is it's kind of a joint thing, right? That they are always credited as a pair, and I don't think it is a strict division of labor there. This was their first major manga work as a duo or individually, but it was their first publication of note. They've continued to work together in the years since. A mixture of lower profile shonen material and some other anime adaptations. Probably the thing they're most noted for is they were the writers and creators of Deadman Wonderland.
A
either
classic,
of you I was going to say, are either of you familiar with Deadman Wonderland?
Takes
absolutely.
a drag from a cigarette. Deadman Wonderland. Now that's not a name I've heard in a long time.
A classic, late aughts, early 10s, edgy shonen manga.
Yeah, it's. I'm not going to call it trash, but kind of.
It's kind of a fascinating relic of a bygone era, because in some weird ways, it's there's the alternate universe where Deadman Wonderland becomes the Attack on Titan, anime, monoculture or whatever.
Yes.
It's, and to be clear, edgy seinen adjacent manga still gets made, of course, right? With lots of blood and big boobs boobing, boobily. But
Deadman Wonderland specifically has a very early 2000s vibe to it. It reminds me a lot of stuff like Elfen Lied or Darker Than Black, stuff like that.
It's very much in that vein of Future Diary and Akame ga Kill, these clearly shonen structured, but about murder and psychopaths and
So basically shonen, but with the age rating turned up slightly. I'm not going to
or
call
at
them,
least pretending to have its age rating turned up slightly.
I'm not going to dignify them by calling them seinen, because they clearly are not. But definitely, the kind of thing that ADV Films would have licensed by the bucket load if they still existed there. But I think, not to jump out ahead of our skis here, but I think some of that stuff does, some of that style, some of that tone certainly permeates a little bit into this manga.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
But, before we kick off on discussing the manga, though, let's just talk a little about its structure. This is a 6-volume manga. 6 tankobons there, so it's fairly short, especially compared to a 50-episode anime. And this was published in the West. I have physical copies of it gathered into 2 omnibuses, but this was quite widely available, and it is one of the better known parts of the extended Eureka 7 universe. So I had read this manga before, and I quite liked it, but correct me if I'm wrong, neither of you had read it before, right?
No.
Well, obviously, Aqua, you had not, but...
would have been one hell of a twist.
Right, yes.
The manga all along.
Yeah. I was familiar with this manga, I would say, more by reputation.
Right.
I was familiar with its plot beats, right? I mean, it's one of those, like, classic, well, I guess, internet schoolyard things at the time, like, if you were, like, involved in anime forums, like, any talk of Eureka 7 would inevitably get somebody, piping up, hey, did you know Eureka dies in the manga? I
feel like I may have done that myself once or twice. But
right,
yes.
And it's like, and so my perception of the manga prior to reading it was always like, oh, that's that, like, weird, again, EU material thing over there. Thank goodness I don't have to think about alternate takes or interpretations of Eureka 7. Thank goodness it's just this holistically perfect standalone anime.
Indeed, yes. I will say that I don't know, like, I was a little bit older when I watched Eureka 7, obviously. I did not hear a great deal about this manga, like, I found out it existed after watching the show and went to read it because I was interested in an alternate take on this. Aqua, as somebody who went in without any preconceptions whatsoever, what were you expecting out of a manga adaptation of Eureka 7? Because obviously, you're quite well read in terms of manga. You've read lots and lots of manga, both original and adaptations. What were kind of your expectations going into this?
I think usually what you expect when, like, a manga adaptation of a original anime comes out is that you will get the Cliff Notes version of an established anime, right? You will get something that tries to tell the same story, but will cut out major parts and sort of try to stitch up the holes it creates by taking, well, not necessarily shortcuts. Shortcuts is a bit like is kind of like a negative term, but sort of like condense and make the story a little bit more concise. Right. I think that is the sort of ideal of whenever this happens.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, manga adaptations, especially of anime original stories, tend to be, if not afterthoughts, they are generally, I don't really want to say low effort, because obviously even the simplest manga has a great deal of effort involved, right? But they tend to be arms of advertising more than anything else.
So that's the thing, right? They are essentially commercials for the anime. Like, no one wants you to read the manga to completion. They first and foremost want you to tune in for the anime and then maybe also, like, read the manga on the side. And I think that's sort of interesting, because that sort of means that the manga in and by itself sort of can't be the definitive version of the story.
Absolutely. And I think that is something we will talk about with this manga. I will point out that that's the inversion of the normal situation, because the vast majority of anime are adapted from manga. And let's be very clear here, most anime are an advertisement for the manga.
Yes.
Like, almost explicitly.
In Japan, manga is the main product, right? Manga is way more mainstream than anime. It's the thing that lots of people buy, lots of people read on the train. And anime is the more niche version that mostly exists to either, throw hardcore fans of a manga a bone or to attract new readers, which is why most anime sort of don't mind that they don't fully complete the story of the anime, of the manga, of the original manga, because they've already served their purpose, right?
Right, yeah, and that is why, we had just a few years before this Full Metal Alchemist, when the manga was only half complete, let's say, because, again, the point of the show was to act as a promotion for the manga. That's not to say, of course, that anime based on manga cannot be good. Many of them are extremely good, but it's important to bear that function in mind. And in the same way, it's important to bear in mind this manga's function as an advert for the anime. Having said that, I think this thing is kind of unique in the spun-off stories of Eureka 7, in that it is a story that was written as the narrative was developing and sort of represents a parallel path that was developed at the same time as the show was airing, right? Whereas almost all the other expanded universe works are reactions to the show itself. So we might as well dive in and see what to make of it, And one thing I will say to the listeners, is we're not going to do this thing beat by beat, chapter by chapter. This is more kind of like a big overview, just about our feelings and some of the more general feelings about the manga. So, G, I want to start with you. This manga obviously represents quite a sizable deviation from the show that we have just watched. And I think you've mentioned a few times that you're not necessarily a huge fan of spins on the Eureka 7 story. How did you feel about this, having read it through to completion?
So, joking aside, I found this manga to be, an academically interesting exercise, is I guess how I would put it, right? I think
there's a lot of loaded subtext on both sides of the coin in that answer, I think.
I think, is it a cop-out to say it was interesting? A little bit, right? I think, there is no world in which... I guess that's a thing. There is no world in which this could be my definitive Eureka 7 story. And there is no world in which I could read just this manga and walk away feeling like I had engaged in a satisfying narrative work. And some of that is because I watched the anime first, right? And so... in the same way that, in the main podcast, I feel like I am often the guy who's like, well, in the original manga, this is how they approach this thing, and this is why I don't like what they did in the anime. And going the other way around, I think truly, because it was written concurrently with the anime, and I'm sure that they were given some notes about where things were going, right? But
I'm sure they had an outline, but at the same time, I suspect that they had less than we would guess, if that makes sense.
And I think that's what makes the Eureka 7 manga so interesting, because it is familiar in many parts, right? There are the same characters are there for the most part. Many of the plot beats are there. The same terminology is being used, but for example, the Vodorak have almost zero presence in the manga. The Corallians are portrayed in a much more sinister, antagonistic light.
Yeah, I mean, they are unambiguously the villains in the
manga. Ray and Charles are completely absent from the manga, right? And I think I think there's some interesting stuff there. I think that what they do instead of that, I think some of it, I wouldn't necessarily want it folded back into the anime, but I think it's an interesting and valid interpretation. I also look at it and go, this sure is kind of a less interesting version of Eureka 7 that does not really succeed in earning the same emotional catharsis that the anime did.
Right. It does very much seem like they watched the first 5 episodes of the anime, and then they got a feeling of okay, we know who these characters are, we have all the pawns, they're in their positions, and now we'll just sort of try to infer where this would go if we follow the conventions of shonen storytelling. This is probably where we'll end up, and then that is the story that they write, as opposed to an actual adaptation of Eureka 7, because as you mentioned, G, basically everything that is introduced post those first 5 episodes is not in this manga. There's no Ray and Charles, there's no Norb, there's no Sakuya. It's just sort of a draw a circle, draw the rest of the owls kind of situation.
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the things which is fascinating to me is the way that things occasionally float back into recognizable patterns. It's almost as if there are kind of like big tentpole events which the mangaka were told about and they worked around. But the further you drift from those events, the more deviant the story becomes. There is still, for example, a big showdown between Holland and Dewey on the deck of the Ginga. But the context is very different, the outcome is very different, and the location, the timing is very different. And I think one of the most interesting things about the manga is that it is, as an unashamed positive, I would say that one of the things I enjoy about this manga is that it is so different from the show itself. It is unapologetic about going its own way, and by the end, it has almost sort of shifted genre away from whatever the show is into something very different. Aqua, as somebody who has only just seen the TV show and therefore has a less ingrained sort of attachment / knowledge of it, how did you feel about this being sort of like your first alternate spin on these characters, these scenarios?
I think this manga is indeed an interesting beast because I think my opinion of it varies very much depending on what point of the manga you talk about. I think in the first 2-ish volumes, it is kind of like a shallow facsimile of the original show. You have the major points, you have the major characters, but they all seem to have in some way lost their edge a little bit, or they have been smoothed down, they have been simplified. A lot of the thematic strength, a lot of the messiness in those early bits is kind of gone.
Holland doesn't even hit anyone.
Right. Like you have Holland, who is way more mellow in this. You have Anemone, who's just slightly off, who's just kind of like a weird, quirky girl, as opposed to being the evil woman we know and love. You have characters who have certain motifs and quirks that they don't have in the anime. Like Holland likes to drink coffee, and how Anemone constantly references the scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz, which is just not a thing in the original anime.
No, in fact, it is a very, very different conception of the character altogether.
Yeah. But then I think the story sort of settles in the large gap that it has to bridge, which is basically the entire middle of the anime. You have the Ray and Charles arc, you have the stuff with Norb and the Vodorak, which the manga sort of skips over, and they sort of skip immediately to Dewey enacting his plan and triggering the apocalypse. And I think it sort of manages to pull that off relatively decently. Of course, there are some victims, Dewey's characterization is completely gone. He's just the most generic evil overlord kind of guy in the manga imaginable.
And to be clear, that's kind of where he ends up in the TV show as well, but he takes an interesting path to get there.
Right, that's the thing, right? In the TV show, they peel back these layer after layer after layer, constantly revealing that he is even more insane than you thought he was. Whereas here in the anime, he's sort of from the beginning a maniacal, nihilistic, overlord who wants to destroy everything.
And that's a thing, right? I think a lot of the parts actually are remarkably similar between the two. Yes, the eventual characterization of Dewey, but as I always harp on, right? The anime benefits from time, right? From screen time, from episode count, right? And so when Dewey eventually reveals how much of a petty, nihilistic loser he is by the end of the show, it feels kind of earned because it's the payoff on having put up with dozens of episodes of him being, fucking Diet Senator Armstrong, out here, right? Fake Hitler, right? And
it reveals the pettiness at the core of his like fascistic brouhaha.
Right. Like, whereas the manga kind of like, even if the manga arrives at the same like quote unquote correct conclusion for the character, because it's so truncated, it doesn't necessarily earn the payoff to the same degree.
I think one of the things that struck me on this reread, certainly, is that the manga is just generally a smaller scale, more in a story with greater interiority, right?
Yeah.
Like it is more focused. The large cast is mostly pushed to the side. This is mostly a story about 6 people: Holland and Yuri, Renton and Eureka, and Dominic and Anemone. Right?
Yes.
Almost everything else is sort of comes out in the wash, and it is a story that is more focused on the interiority of those characters, right? Rather than the anime, which is very much about finding your place in the world and in whatever passes as society. This is sort of more of a personal story, a story that's focused on individual journeys and individual motivations.
I think something that plays to this manga's favor is the fact that Eureka 7, the original anime, is sort of a story that goes in waves, right? You have moments of intensity, climaxes alternating with moments of downtime. For example, in the sort of character arcs of Renton and Eureka, their relationship very much goes from, they completely trust each other, to there is something wrong between them, going back to they completely trust each other, going back to there's something wrong between them throughout the entire show. And this sort of allows the manga to condense that into a single story arc, right? Because in the manga, there is a single like crisis moment in the relationship between Renton and Eureka, which then gets resolved for the climax of the entire story. Whereas in the original anime, you sort of have within that arc, there are multiple smaller arcs that go in a sort of wave-like pattern, giving the show its very distinct sort of push and pull effect that I think the manga can sort of smartly do only once, as opposed to the 5 and 6 times the anime does it, in a way that still makes it feel like Eureka 7, even though you are only spending a smaller, like a very, very small part of the time with those characters.
Right, and I think part of that is the inherent style of storytelling that is necessary to sustain a 50-episode anime, right? Is that you cannot be all escalation all the time. You have to have story arcs, you have to have rise and fall, you have to have space for the audience and the characters to breathe, right? The manga only has, 100 or so chapters, right?
Yeah. No, the manga has literally 23 chapters. Each tankobon has four chapters, except for the first one, which has 3.
Sure, I guess I was mixing up the length of a chapter there, but
they have longer than they have like monthly publication chapter length as opposed to weekly publication chapter length.
So, but the point is, like the story, there is just less time overall, right? Even though manga can communicate action faster than animation can, there's still a limit to how much advantage that gives you. And so I think the decision to kind of like scale back on size and instead focus on individual character journeys is kind of a smart decision as well. The downside is, of course, that we lose some of the stuff which made Eureka 7 so interesting, like the world building, the large ensemble cast. The one thing I would say about this manga, maybe as a critique more than anything else, is that it is a much more conventional story that is much more conventionally told, right? Would you guys agree with that?
Absolutely.
I think so, yeah.
But I do think the first 2 volumes are a little bit weird in that regard, because they have to set these pieces into place in very little time. So, for example, how Dominic and Anemone are introduced in the manga is very different from how it is in the anime, and also very weird and kind of contrived. but it's clear that the authors wanted to get these characters front and center as quickly as possible because, as Zigg said, this is the story about, they're one third of the story that the authors here want to tell.
Yeah, and I think, of all the characters who change and are warped in the transition between mediums, I think Dominic and Anemone might be the most interesting, actually. Let's talk a little bit about Anemone. In the two characters, show Anemone and manga Anemone, are kind of completely different except for the basic idea that girls do be crazy, right? That's got, like, this Anemone is way friendlier, way more self-aware, I would say, more sexually aggressive, and at the same time kind of more scatterbrained.
Yeah,
right?
She is a bit more like the kooky, like, she says such random things version of Anemone, whereas in the anime, Anemone is mostly just like pissed all the time.
Yes, and I think, I think this is another example of them taking her characterization from the beginning of the story and kind of just running on that, right? Like in the show, we only really see, like Gadfly, Trolley, and then Anemone for like an episode and a bit, maybe, before she starts her long, slow mental collapse. Whereas here, it's kind of her default state of being, right? She's also just way less vicious, way less sadistic in general, and seems more mentally stable, if just a little bit out to lunch, really. We only see her get injected with the evil woman juice once or twice, and it doesn't even really make her that evil.
Yeah, she is mostly set up as a tragic victim in the manga, rather than the like antagonistic role that she plays in the anime.
Yeah. I mean, G, obviously Anemone is one of your favorite characters. How do you feel about this interpretation of her?
Kind of echoing what you guys said, right? Of like, it sure is a facsimile of Anemone. In all seriousness, I do actually think that like there are some interesting bits and pieces here in this characterization. There is sort of her weird, like, I don't even know how I describe it, right? Like, she's always talking about how she wants to eat things that taste good. This weird,
her
like,
four fetish.
Like, yeah, I think it's more.
Please, we have enough weird fetishy Anemone fan art already.
I think it's more like I guess like a metaphor for a sort of like hedonistic pursuit of life, right? She wants nice, comfortable things, right? And I guess this could be sort of tied into like, the whole, Anemone just wants to be a normal girl thing, right? That is kind of an aspect of her character in both versions.
I think the eating motif also represents her desire, like her feeling of incompleteness, right? Like she wants to swallow and assimilate things into herself to herself.
I mean, which mirrors her to how the Scub Coral are represented in this manga. Of course, absolutely. They are an assimilating force.
Yes, a lot of the Wizard of Oz scarecrow imagery is very goth merengue, to be honest. I probably could have done without it. But, I think she is an interesting alternate take on the character, recognizable, but not necessarily familiar.
Right. And to be fair, it's like there are aspects of like this version of Anemone Dominic that like, I would not want it to replace the version we get in the anime, but like, the anime version of Dominic and Anemone's relationship may have benefited by supplementing in some of the stuff that's here in the manga. I think some of it's a little contrived. The whole like, oh, actually they secretly like met as children is like, I do not need that. But like,
that's interesting because it's kind of intentionally or unintentionally, they kind of do the Norb and Sakia thing with them. Right?
That's kind of what they end up being, right?
Yeah, which is that Dominic was her attendant ever since she was a little girl, and I have no idea whether that was deliberate but it's certainly thematically relevant there. But I agree with you, G. I think perhaps a little bit more warmth in their relationship would have made the sort of finale of their plot arc a touch more believable.
But yeah, that's more what I'm getting at, right? Yeah. I think because here's the thing, I think taken on its own, Dominic and Anemone having a more conventionally warm relationship in the manga kind of makes that relationship less interesting. Like, what kind of makes their relationship interesting is how antagonistic it is for much of the show's run. But, like, I think implementing some of that warmth maybe earlier in the show would, like, make that ride a little bit smoother.
Because I do think that the overall resolution of Dominic and Anemone's plotline is kind of better in the manga. Like, I get less.
You're just saying that because Dominic dies in the manga.
No. It's more like I think, to echo what you said, I think it could have, like, the anime could have benefited from bringing a little bit more of that warmth, because in the manga I am more inclined to believe that Dominic truly cares for Anemone, whereas in the anime I've always sort of had the feeling of like, oh, they're hooking these two up because that the plot says so. And I also like how in the manga the sort of Anemone redemption arc is more based on her value as an individual rather than as a clone of Eureka, and the fact that someone loves her for who she is. And that is also in the anime, but in the anime they focus more on her, like, oh, I wish I could be a normal girl and go shopping with my friends. It's sort of the same thing, but I think the angle that the manga takes was slightly more endearing to me personally.
Sure.
I think an important part of that as well is the fact that this version of Dominic is way less of a wiener than the one in the anime, right? Like, I'm not necessarily saying he's a better or more interesting character, but he is more self-assured, he is more decisive, he is more traditionally heroic.
He even pilots a mech in the manga.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which actually is, like, maybe, here's the thing, thematically, like, you guys are right that, like, I think the version of Dominic in the manga is a little bit more conventionally heroic. I almost kind of don't like that. Like, it's a little like,
yes.
like, it's a little goofy to me that the grand climax of the manga is Renton has to fly to save Eureka, but he needs a wingman. It's Dominic. It's like, really?
I'll back you up on this, because I do think the manga is very much the, like, it's very clear who their favorite characters are.
Like, the idea of, like, oh, here's my, back-to-back brothers in arms.
Yeah.
Renton and Dominic.
The chatification of Dominic.
I do think that it's cool that we get to see the End and the Nervash fighting side by side.
It is cool. And so that's what I mean, right? Well, this is why I say, again, like, maybe it's loaded the way I describe it. It's why I do find the manga interesting, because there are aspects where it's like, okay, to be fair, it would have been cool to see that in the anime, but I think in the context of what Eureka 7 is and what I love about that story, I think a lot of the manga's decisions, as we're saying, make it a little bit of a less interesting story. And that's why it's like, I think there are aspects of the manga that I think would have been fun to implement into the anime, but I would never want the manga to replace the anime. Because, for example, the End and Nervash fighting back-to-back, that's cool. But I kind of like that, Dominic is a wiener. Like, but you know what?
This is exactly what I was going to say. Is that thematically, it is important that Dominic sucks, right?
And because the thing is, like, guys that suck can still be wife guys, right? Like Dominic is as much a wife guy as Renton is. It's just he also kind of sucks on a personal level, and in some ways, that's what makes him charming. So turning him into a more conventional Renton-like mech protagonist, it's like, you're losing a little bit of the contrast there.
Yeah, and I think, Dominic in the show also represents an important, thematic point as somebody who was a true believer in Dewey, who gradually grows disillusioned with his new world order and all of that stuff, right? And realizes that it is hurting people in general and one person, Anemone in particular. That's a more interesting plot arc than just being super wife guy, which is what he is in the manga,
Right. And the thing is, it's also like they add something in the manga, like they give him an explicit backstory that he was orphaned by the previous horrors that happened in this world, and Dewey sort of took him in. And I don't know, but I will die on the hill that Dominic is a trust fund baby who grew up pampered and like.
I mean, those backstories are not mutually exclusive.
I guess, but I like to think of Dominic as someone who was given a position, a high-ranking position in the military based simply on who he was rather than on his skills. Like, that explains so much about his character to me.
Yeah, I mean, like, and the only point I would question on that is that, to me, it has always been clear that Dominic's position is solely because of his devotion to Dewey. Right?
Yeah.
All of his power flows from Dewey. So I think that it makes sense that no matter what version of backstory you want for him, that he is sort of extremely close to Dewey and sort of almost a fanatic, which he is at the beginning of the TV show, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's very funny that they make him pilot the end and he has to get into the ridiculous, you know, eyes flying harness, which was very obviously just designed to, you know, make Anemone look extremely sexy while piloting it, and then he has to hang in that thing as well. It's pretty funny.
But he took his shirt off, so it's like he's Jesus on the cross.
Yes, definitely. I'm sure that's what they were going for there.
It's very goofy because, like, I mean, you know, most mechs, it's like, all right, look, man, like, you put Amuro in any fucking mobile suit, he'll make it work, right? But, like, because the end is the, like, evil flesh creature mech, like, I feel like narratively the implication is supposed to be only a psycho hopped up on evil woman juice could pilot the end. So the idea that, like, oh, wait, actually, no, anybody can pilot the end, it just has a weird cockpit.
It's just weird to see, like, somebody other than Anemone in her sexy evil plug suit piloting that thing. You know, it just doesn't
it's also weird
work.
Because in the manga they explicitly acknowledge that they have to, like, shoot Anemone up with Eureka's plasma in order to make her more Corellian-like so she can pilot the end.
Yeah, and there's some vague illusion that is what the evil woman juice is in the show as well, but they don't really dwell on it, you know, beyond it being something that stabilizes her mental and physical degradation, right? Like, it's this is something that I think we should touch on, you know, is that the manga goes way bigger on body horror stuff.
Oh,
like, there is a lot of, not necessarily, like, I would not call it, you know, nasty or disturbing. You know, it's fairly table stakes for in the realms of manga, you know, somewhere where you can go real bad into this stuff. But it's definitely more focused on, like, Gorn and sort of Cthulhu-esque monstrous mutations than the show was. And the show did quite a bit of that in general as well. So,
but there definitely is a greater emphasis on it in the manga that I actually do like. That part I actually do kind of appreciate, because I think, not that I want Eureka 7 to be this sort of like hardcore gore fest, but, like, you know, it is an anime that is very interested in, like, violent action, right? Like, an ethnic cleansing occurs in the anime, you know, like Renton stomps that dude out. You know, like, there are these, like, bouts of, like, extreme violence in the anime, and I kind of like some parts of, like, the ways in which the manga chooses to lean into that, right? Like, obviously,
I think one change in particular that is actually better than the anime is Renton being way more thrown off by the discovery that Eureka is this living plant monster,
and I think that works because of how they portray the Corellians in the manga, right? Because, like, you know, I mean, we live in the era of the monster fucker, right? Like, like being attracted to a boy or a girl with different colored skin and antenna is, like, not really weird in 2026 anymore. But, like, even back in the original Eureka 7, it's like there's never really like Renton's love for Eureka is never, like, or physical attraction to Eureka is never truly tested, right? Like,
no, even when she's a weird bubblegum slime.
Yeah, it's like she's, you know, she becomes, like, gum for a bit. Oh no, she gets a haircut and some minor cosmetic scarring, and oh no, now she got a green gem in her head and her arm is green, and oh no, now she's got cool butterfly. You know what I mean? It's all sort of conventional enough that, like, you could never, like, if Eureka ever said, "Don't look at me, I'm a monster," it's like you can't really believe it, right?
No, it's very soft pedaled. You know, even when she is meant to be pocked with scars. You know, she is still extremely cute because it's an anime and you've got to draw cute girls.
And I kind of like that, like at least that one scene in the manga where like when Eureka is like covered in all the Corallian stuff, and it's like she looks like she's being devoured by like an alien plant. Like it's rough, and like if that was Renton's in that version of the story, when that is Renton's first exposure to what the Corallian is, like his like revulsion and fear is way more believable. Right? It's like no matter how much he likes and loves the girl Eureka, to see her in that form, I think would shake a lot of people, especially a 14, 15-year-old boy.
Yeah, and I think his reaction in the manga is appropriately more histrionic than it is in the show, where it is kind of, you know, it's not nothing, but it's underplayed. You know, shout outs to the scene inside the Corallian where fake Eureka literally just splits in half into like a mouthful of horrible teeth and tentacles. That's very Call of Cthulhu there.
I mean, the body horror element is also very interesting because this is a show about humanity, right? The whole idea is that we are asking ourselves the question if Corallian and humanity can coexist. And the body horror sort of serves as a reminder of how weird and foreign and alien the Corallians are, that they defy or sort of even pervert what we would accept as not even conventional, but just like acceptable appearances for a sentient being.
And, I think that sort of ties into one of the most fundamental changes in the manga, right? Whereas the show's conclusion is that we can live together, the manga's conclusion is very much no, we cannot live together.
Yeah, they even give Renton the like Sayano Uta. I see the people I love as like horrible flesh creatures at some point.
Yeah, it's the last. Let's say the last volume of the manga, which mostly takes place inside the Corallian and a series of like delusions and dream worlds and stuff, especially gets real eldritch towards the end there. And it's a choice, all right. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we talk about, I think this is one of the reasons why some people have a very strong negative reaction to this version of the story, right? Because this version of the story is fundamentally about how Dewey's kind of right. That the scub coral is a invading force which is destroying humanity ultimately. So, I mean, like, they can't go all the way to Dewey's right because, you know, he's still a psychopath who wants to kill everyone. But definitely, you know, how do we feel about the scub coral being a much more actively antagonistic presence in this version of the story?
The thing is, I find it I'm of two minds about it, right? Because on one hand, I'm sort of fundamentally opposed to any story that portrays coexistence between different races or species as fundamentally impossible, just like from a political point of view.
Right.
But on the other hand, I do think the story tries to add a little bit of nuance to this idea and doesn't necessarily make the scub coral a metaphor for, you know, the other, the alien, the foreigner, but more like you could see it as a metaphor for like endless consumption, you know, endless assimilation. Because at the end, Renton says that the Corallians chose life by dying, by which it's sort of implied that the Corallians made the active decision to stop assimilating, to stop expanding in order to preserve life on the planet, rather than killing everything just to ensure their own survival, which I think adds an interesting nuance to the central difference of this manga between with the anime, right?
And you know, we get a very visual representation of that in the, you know, sort of Eureka and Renton battling against the, whatever you want to call it, the soul, the core consciousness of the scub coral, right? The ending is effectively Eureka's altruism as part of the scub coral winning out against the other parts of the consciousness's kill 'em all mentality.
Yeah. And in that regard, I even think that for the story this manga is trying to tell, I think I might actually prefer how it ends. By which I do not mean that I think this is the ending that should have been the anime's ending,
right.
because it wouldn't work, because the anime is completely different, has completely different themes and a completely different vibe. I just think that maybe for what this manga is trying to be, I kind of maybe like the ending more than I like the anime's ending in relation to what the anime wants to be. If that makes sense.
I can see that. I think that the ending of the manga is a brave and interesting choice that I'm not going to say I prefer it, but I think it is appropriate to the story that is being told here, which is basically what you were saying as well, right? Gee, let's talk a little bit about that ending. How do you feel? I mean, obviously the big thing here is Eureka dying rather than surviving, but how do you feel about where we end this story as opposed to where we end the anime?
So, yeah, as you guys said, again, holistically, academically, I think there is value in the manga ending of Eureka 7. I think, again, as an interpretation of this story, it is a valid path to take. Emotionally...
We're building up to the mother of all butts here.
Emotionally, it does not work for me, right?
Sure.
Because emotionally, Eureka 7 is the patron saint of, I hope these two crazy kids can make it in this messed up world.
We may have mentioned that once or twice, yes.
Yeah. The whole point of Eureka 7, in my mind, right? The whole point of Eureka 7, the story, the anime primarily, but is about these two kids finding each other, finding love, making it work against all the odds, against every cosmic force, every political movement working against them, right? It is Eureka 7 is the story that is about how love can save the world, right? And I think the Eureka 7 manga still gets at aspects of that, right? Because yes, it is still their love that convinces the scub coral to not assimilate humanity in the earth. But I think fucking doing the, Nia dying at the end of Gurren Lagann shit.
We can't litigate that one here now. Trust me.
No, to be clear, I think that works in Gurren Lagann. I think I know there are still people like those Japanese soldiers in the Philippines still fighting those wars on the internet about the end of Gurren Lagann. I know they are. I'm telling you, come home.
Yes.
Come home, young man. That war is over. We have to move on. But
nobody cares.
It's never over. It's never over.
But I think doing that, I don't know if that works for me in Eureka 7. It feels like, I don't know, it's meant to feel bittersweet and sad, and it's supposed to feel like the passing of adolescence, right? The death of childhood, right? Blah blah blah, all that stuff. I don't know if that works for me in Eureka 7.
So I'm going to say that, I've just said that I kind of like it as a choice, but I see where you're coming from as well, right? And also, I think it's harder to accept as a bittersweet ending because, quite frankly, this version of Eureka is just a less developed character than the one in the show, right? It's not that she doesn't have any development. She has a fairly interesting arc, I think, but she's just not we're not as invested in what she is and who she is, right? And
she kind of almost serves more as a first love that is the catalyst for Renton to grow up. She is very much my first girlfriend turned into the moon. That's rough, buddy.
Yes, yes, and I think this is. I think part of this is where the weakness of the compressed manga format begins to show, right? Is that without the cast of supporting characters being fully developed, we just have way less of an understanding of how these characters fit into the world, and that makes them seem shallower by comparison, right? I mean, the children are basically not in the manga a great deal, and without without that important sort of connection, I think Eureka suffers as a character. I think she becomes I'm not going to say she is a MacGuffin, but she becomes primarily important because of her connection to the Corellians.
I might actually go as far as say Eureka in the manga is closer to actually being the accusation of a Rei clone than anime Eureka.
I think it's a mild case, but I think you have a point, yes.
I think overall, like, this manga is very much like, if you look at it from a certain angle, you can say that this is just straight up not Eureka 7, right? Mirroring what G said, as in Eureka 7 is a show about, true love conquering all, but that is not the only
delivery.
Yeah, this is not the only theme that is very present in the anime that is just kind of completely absent from the manga, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the environmental messaging is gone. A lot of the struggles that the adult characters have with being someone that can live up to the expectations of the younger generation, which is one of the things that I find the most interesting about this show, is just not here. And this is far more of a kind of conventional story about defeating the evil alien that wants to assimilate all.
Right, yeah. I mean, it loops back to what I said earlier, in that this is a well-constructed story, an interesting story, a story that makes some brave choices and decisions, but it is ultimately a much more conventional story. It is a story full of safe, creative choices and familiar character archetypes. It's like we were talking about Anemone earlier. It's much easier to write her as kind of gadfly-ish and, aggressively sexy with a mean streak, because that is a pre-existing archetype that exists in manga and anime and has for years, right? I'm not saying that anime Anemone is, a completely original, super unseen creation either, but again, and I don't even necessarily blame the authors for that, right? They were given what I'm sure was a very difficult task with minimal amounts of actual creative input. I suspect that they did the best they could under the circumstances, but that's always going to result in a story that is more formulaic than having full creative freedom, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But I do think it's interesting now that you mentioned the authors, in that you do see a lot of their proclivities in this manga.
Absolutely.
If you look at how Anemone is portrayed in this manga, she is pretty much a one-for-one dead ringer for the character of Shiro in Deadman Wonderland, who is also this sort of loopy, overly clingy, quote-unquote psycho girl who can lose it at any moment.
Manic pixie girlfriend, but also evil.
Basically,
dark manic pixie dream girl.
Yeah, and also the fixation on body horror, the more overall grimy, gritty, edgier sort of aesthetic of this manga makes it very reminiscent of Deadman Wonderland as well. When I found out that these were the writers of that manga, everything sort of fell in place for me. This is just sort of who they are. This is what they like to do with stories, what they are good at. Because I can pretty much say, I think the final 2 volumes of this manga are just straight up good for what they are. Because at that point you've already abandoned all pretense that this is Eureka 7 with the themes of the Eureka 7 that we fell in love with, and it's just basically cool shonen action horror spectacle.
Yeah, I mean,
in that regard, it sort of succeeds. But yes, if you're going in here looking for the same thematic wealth and range that the Eureka 7 anime has, you're not going to find it. But honestly, I wouldn't expect, I don't think if you're expecting something like that, given the circumstances of this manga's production and also how long it is, I think that might be a you problem more than a problem with the manga.
I mean, I will again reiterate, I think all of this manga is pretty good. I enjoy it. And I think part of the reason I enjoy it is not necessarily for its quality as a standalone work, but the ways in which it is in dialogue with the anime, right? It is interesting as a companion piece because it makes some different choices and some choices which are contrary to the spirit and ethos of the show, right? I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing that it is darker, that it is more violent, that it is more pessimistic, that it is focused on a smaller cast, because again, those are interesting choices that are made in opposition to the choices of the anime.
That is again. So when I said at the start, when I said that this is an academically interesting manga, right? That is kind of why this is why I'm here saying these things, and I'm not like frothing at the mouth about how not only did they ruin Eureka 7, but they censored out whatever Anemone's vagina bones, or however that tweet goes, right? Like, because I think looking at it from a distance, it is an interesting thing, because I don't really know if we quite do things like this anymore, right? Like, I think we've all sort of talked about how the modern adaptation of a manga in anime form is very, very heavily regulated. Not the right word. It's not like there's government regulation.
I think what you're trying to say is that there is a greater degree of creative control over all aspects of the product.
Exactly. Right. So even if like the anime is taking, liberties with like production value, right? Like say compare, the Demon Slayer manga to the anime, for example, right? Like the narrative beats are now expected to be like as close to one as possible, right? Like, there's a particular, younger, newer breed of anime fan that like gets mad when the anime does not copy the same like angles and framings of the original panels. Right. That is sort of the new expectation that that a good adaptation is an accurate adaptation. And
right.
I would say
I think a lot of that has been influenced by people like us reading the manga and then saying, well, this is no good because it's not like the manga. I mean, we are not innocent of that.
No, we are the Full Metal Alchemist generation, right? Like we are the generation that gives the 2003 anime its almost like Guy Fawkes effigy-esque reputation, right?
Among some people, let's say. Some of us enjoy the complete insanity of the 2003 anime's ending.
The way I've always said it, man, Machete watching order, watch the first 20 episodes of the 2003 Full Metal Alchemist, and then jump into Brotherhood around season 2 or something. Yeah. But
also, the thing is just saying that you prefer the original is like the easiest shortcut towards seeming like an intellectual connoisseur who knows what he's talking about. Right?
True. But I do think there is some element of the current era of anime we live in is informed by the fact that once upon a time, adaptations used to take bigger, weirder swings, right? And arguably, many of them did not pay off, or were controversial, or for whatever reason, right? And it's because we don't get projects like this anymore. It is only with hindsight, only with decades removed, like decades of emotional distance created, that I think I can like look at something like the Eureka 7 manga and go, "What a novel little thing."
I do think you have to nuance. I do have to nuance that point of view a little bit, because I think that applies, but only to like big mainstream shonen. Because there are a ton of adaptations of manga nowadays that dare to do very like cool and creative things with the source material that do not exist in the source material, right? Like, just look of like Bocchi Rock, for example, where they insert a bunch of like stop motion stuff.
That is true. That is actually entirely valid. When I say adaptation, I am probably speaking to, the shonen adaptation.
The most commercial,
mainstream commercial anime.
The most commercial manifestation of this idea.
But I would say even the things that are like somewhere that are not as big in mainstream, right? Though I feel often are pressured to again, not copy the original source material 1-to-1, but at least hew closer to its original, emotional and narrative intent, right? Like for example, let's just look at say, the two big fantasy adaptations, right? Freyren and Dungeon Meshi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which as someone who is familiar with both the anime and the manga, both those adaptations are taking quite a number of liberties, visually and even occasionally narratively in terms of how they package things. But at the end of the day, they are staying within the guidelines of the source material. Whereas the thing that I think is interesting about the Eureka 7 manga is the fact that it is not, right? That it is going entirely off pasture. And again, I think that's a thing that in 2005, I probably would have chafed against a lot more. But in 2026, I am much more generous to it, I think.
Yeah. I think it's also just like a matter of anime studios know that there is a lot more riding on the anime or on the adaptation, whether it's from anime to manga or from manga to anime. Because like we said at the beginning of this episode that, manga is the main product and anime mostly serves to advertise it. But over the past couple of years, anime studios in Japan have become aware of the fact that in the West, like, anime is the main product.
Right. I was going to say that tendency is strongly linked towards the globalization of the product, right?
So I think they do interpret that as meaning, we have to be more true to the original author's vision, because this is the version of that story that is going to reach the widest audience.
Right. And, in the classic capital subsumes all into it, the idea of a faithful adaptation has itself become a marketing point, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at the evolution of the Fate Stay Night adaptations, for example, from the Dean anime to, Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel, those later productions were partially advertised as more true to the text adaptations, right?
Just look at how many like reboots and remakes are explicitly marketed as more like faithful to the original source material. Like that is often their entire raison d'etre. That's why they made Sailor Moon Crystal. That's why they're making that new One Piece. That's why they're like even in Hollywood, whenever they make a remake of something that has already been made, their excuse will always be, well, this time we'll be more faithful to the source material.
Right. Yeah. And I think the point we're trying to get to through all of this is that it's not necessarily a case of the manga being better or worse than the anime, but it is interesting that a different creative team were allowed to take a crack at this basic idea and produced such a different adaptation that so distinctly reflects their own personal tastes and skills and style as a storyteller. In a certain sense, that's what we want, right? We want authors to stamp their own individual style onto works that they are responsible for.
And to be clear, I think this is an objectively worse product than the anime, but I also agree with everything you just said.
I would probably agree with you, but again, like I said, I don't think that makes it bad because I have such a high opinion of the anime that many things can be worse than the anime and still be pretty good, And I think as a standalone story, it's decent. I think as a piece in dialogue with the anime, it is fascinating and even quite subversive in some senses.
I mean, the world in which this duo writes this manga but files off all the Eureka 7 branding, I'd probably go, hey, this is a pretty solid freshman effort from a new a new creative duo. I wonder what they'll do next.
This manga is like interesting enough to be evaluated on its own merits rather than just good adaptation or bad adaptation. To quote the immortal words of Lindsay Ellis, it is not about thing good or thing bad. It is about thing exists.
Yeah, and I think I certainly, when I was much younger, was impressed enough to make this part of my permanent collection. Going back on it now, I'm not sure whether I enjoyed it as much as I remember, but I certainly found it more interesting than I remembered, and I think that's, G, we opened by perhaps slightly mocking you for saying that interesting was the most the thing you were willing to credit it for. But at the end of the day, I think that's what we've all found, right? That it is interesting. Does anybody want to have, chip in anything, some final words before we wrap up the discussion of the manga here?
One thing, a Blue Mondays tradition that we have not yet touched upon. It's very interesting that this manga follows the tradition of the anime of naming every chapter after a musical reference.
Yes.
Yes, good point.
However, whereas the original anime mostly refers to like dance music, electronic music, club music, fun, usually like vibing music, music to chill out to, music to dance to.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All of the chapters of this manga are named after like punk and grunge and new metal songs.
Music with edge.
Yep.
I mean, is that not perfect for the people who would go on to make Deadman Wonderland?
Yes. It is almost too on the nose.
Right. Like if the original Eureka 7 was the brainchild of a particular type of like
techno hippie.
Yes, techno hippie. Then of course the Deadman Wonderland guys are going all in on like grunge and new metal.
Yep. We're just calling chapter Siamese Dream after the Smashing Pumpkins album, or The Heretic Anthem, my favorite, after a Slipknot song.
Oh, jeez. I think I like this manga less now. Anyway, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this particular exploration of another world of Eureka 7, but our explorations are not finished yet, because next we will be looking at another very interesting, very different interpretation of the show. For the next episode, we will be looking at Eureka 7, the movie.
This is why I kept trying to put off this podcast.
It was G who sabotaged our
actually, little did you know, Aqua, I flew out to your house to Belgium, and I was taking a bolt cutter to your internet lines.
So this movie, we will probably do a whole bit on the various names of this movie, but this movie is most commonly known in English-speaking countries as Good Night, Sleep Tight, Young Lovers. That is the title you will normally find it under. But yes, we are going to watch this entire movie, and then we are going to discuss it. And it sounds like G already has some thoughts in the chamber ready to go, but we will have to see. I have not seen this movie in a number of years, so it will be interesting to go back.
One could say we always have thoughts about the post-show Eureka 7 material.
Indeed. Look, I mean, there's a reason I started with the manga, right, which is that it's broadly pretty good. Let's see how far down the rabbit hole we can go there. But that's to look forward to, ? Next time. For now, let us know your thoughts on the manga if you've read it. Let us know your sickest panel of teeth and flesh devouring people. Leave us a comment, leave us a YouTube comment, whatever you like there.
Tell us your favorite Slipknot song.
Don't do that, I'll get mad. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, Stitcher, YouTube, all the normal stuff, ring the bell, all of the 3 calls to action, whatever they are. All that remains is for me to say thank you to Aqua Gaze. Thank you, Aqua.
I can't believe we didn't talk about Holland picking up Mater's skirt.
God, that did happen, didn't it? To be fair, he did get punished by having that arm chopped off later. So, karma there. Thank you, G.
Always happy to be on.
Always a pleasure, and we will see you all